Russian military losses. Russian military losses in the war against Ukraine are a subject of intense discussion and analysis, with data varying significantly depending on the source. As expected, neither side is eager to disclose information about its own losses. However, some details are known. The sources of information can be divided into four main groups. Official Russian data. The Russian side rarely publishes figures of its own losses. The last official data was presented at the end of 2022, and even those numbers were too absurd to take seriously. For example, the estimated size of the Russian army involved in the invasion ranged from 200,000 to 250,000 soldiers. On September 21, 2022, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu reported 5,937 Russian soldiers killed. Yet, just a few days later, Putin announced mobilization aiming to recruit another 300,000 soldiers. Numbers that do not align logically. Data from Ukraine. The Ukrainian government and armed forces of Ukraine regularly publish reports on Russian military losses. These figures are often significantly inflated, and if they were entirely accurate, Russia would have surrendered long ago. At the beginning of 2024, it became evident that Ukrainian officials acknowledged this issue. President Volodymyr Zelensky stated that the reported number of eliminated occupiers included not only killed soldiers but also wounded personnel, and the number of equipment also included damaged ones. Previously, Ukrainian sources had repeatedly claimed they were referring only to the number of Russian soldiers killed. This is part of the propaganda aimed at maintaining morale. President Zelensky estimated Russian military losses at 300,000 to 350,000 killed as of February 4, 2025. On February 15, 2025, during his speech at the Munich Security Conference, the president stated that Russia had lost over 250,000 soldiers killed and more than 610,000 wounded. Numbers that do not align logically. Intelligence from NATO, the US, and other Western countries. Western intelligence reports are generally more conservative when it comes to military equipment, but regarding casualties in manpower, the data roughly matches. For instance, in December 2024, NATO chief Mark Rutte stated that Russia had lost 700,000 personnel. On January 23, 2025, President Trump reported that Russia had lost 800,000 troops. On February 9, 2025, he stated that according to his estimates, Russia had lost approximately 1 million soldiers. Numbers that do not align logically. Independent research. This is perhaps the most reliable source of information, as the Russian authorities are unlikely to provide accurate data even after the war ends. The Chechen war serves as a proof. Sources such as BBC, Mediazona, and Meduza conduct in-depth research on personnel losses, relying on open sources such as obituaries, cemeteries, inheritance records, and social media posts from relatives. According to their data, Russian losses in terms of killed soldiers amount to at least 124,000. But why is there such a big difference compared to the official data? Actually, independent estimates are not that different. Here's why. First of all, the research reflects the number of verified and confirmed deaths of Russians, while the researchers themselves admit that the real number is from 45 to 65% higher, as many losses cannot be determined through open sources. Plus, missing persons are not included, and among them several tens of thousands have certainly been killed. Many are still lying somewhere in Ukrainian fields with sunflower seeds in their pockets. Also, they do not include losses among the so-called DPR and LPR forces. And there were mercenaries from other countries, but that's no more than a couple of thousand dead, including North Koreans. So in fact, the enemy's fatal losses by August 2025 may easily reach or even exceed 300,000. As for the wounded, the classic military ratio is considered to be 1 to 3. However, given the well-known meat assaults tactic and the massive problems the Russians face with medical care, evacuation and logistics, the ratio is closer to 1 to 2 or 1 to 2.5. But no matter how you look at it, the total losses of the Russia's army have already exceeded 1 million. Of course, these are not exact figures, and whether they reflect reality or not is known only at the very top of the Russia's army, and they'll never tell the truth to anyone, including Putin himself, should he ever suddenly take an interest. Does Moscow feel these losses? Think about it. There are around 40 countries on this planet with fewer people than Russia has already thrown into the meat grinder in Ukraine. And if the war drags on till the end of the year, the body count could reach the population of, say, Estonia. The short answer is no, it doesn't. Russia doesn't feel the losses, Russia doesn't care about the losses. There are many factors at play here. First, the overall population of 144 million. Then there's the iron grip of state control, the non-stop propaganda machine. We covered that in one of the previous videos. And the massive police apparatus, over 1 million strong, ready to keep order when the war ends and the broken soldiers with PTSD come home and start asking what was it all for. There are also a few other interesting nuances. Those who might get indignant and try to protest are mainly the families of the mobilized, but they make up only a fraction, not even a third, maybe not even a quarter of the total killed or maimed. The majority, however, are volunteers and contract soldiers, as well as convicts, a shrinking share, former PMC mercenaries, now folded into the regular army, and the proxy forces from the so-called DPR and LPR, most of whom Russia has already used up. Russia has effectively turned its own propaganda into reality. By annexing part of Ukraine under the pretense of supporting separatists in a civil war, they not only seized territory but also acquired millions of people. The Geneva Convention states in Article 51 the occupying power may not compel protected persons to serve in its armed or auxiliary forces. No pressure or propaganda which aims at recruiting voluntary enlistment is permitted. But when has Russia ever cared about international law? No, for them people are just resources, and people from occupied territories especially so. Refusing is not an option because they have no rights anymore, and many have families to worry about. The only option is to take up arms and try to survive. However, Russia has been deliberately using troops from the occupied territories as expendable forces. Since the start of the full-scale invasion, Russian forces have forced all men under the age of 60 in newly occupied territories to register for military service. Those who refuse to fight against Ukraine are threatened with losing their jobs and livelihoods. By 2024, over 10,000 men has been mobilized in this way. By the way, it is also known that over 100 indigenous people live in Russia, and Moscow actively uses representatives of national minorities in combat operations, especially from remote and economically depressed regions. This leads to disproportionately high casualties among these populational groups. The Russian authorities are deliberately conducting asymmetric mobilization targeting national minorities to avoid discontent among ethnic Russians in major cities. Losses in military equipment. The best source for tracking equipment losses is Oryx, which counts destroyed military vehicles based solely on photo and video evidence. The actual figures, of course, are much higher, and this, unlike casualties in manpower, is a deeply painful loss for Russia.